So the Arcana cards are the most powerful way that Mel can upgrade herself over the course of the game, and so it's particularly important to understand them and understand them well. And in this video, I'm going to just briefly go over them. I'm going to talk about their use cases. I'm going to give an idea about whether or not they are good based on my own experience, and then towards the end, I will start talking about some Arcana loadouts that worked for me when I was tackling 32 plus Fear. Now, I'm going to go through most of these in order, but there are two Arcana cards which are particularly powerful. The first of which is Debt, and I think that these two Arcana cards need to be talked about first. Now, Debt gives you extra Debt Defiances. At max level, this is 3 extra Debt Defiances, and if you are a returning player from Hades 1, then you know what Debt Defiances are, but if you're not, they're essentially extra lives, right? So Mel, when she dies, if she has Debt Defiances left, instead of losing the run, she will instead pop her Debt Defiance, and then she will get back 40% of her health, right? Once you run out of Debt Defiances and then you die again, you will lose the run. And so 40% of her health is a lot, right? And 3 Debt Defiances is essentially 120% more health. So obviously this is one of the most powerful Arcana cards that you can get, and because having twice as much health can easily be the difference between winning or dying. And so you might be thinking, well, okay, if that is so strong, then why am I saying only one of the most powerful Arcana cards? And why am I talking about it since it's obviously a must take? And the answer is Strength. Now, Strength is only active when you don't have any Debt Defiances, so naturally you kind of want to take either Debt or Strength, not both. But in return for not having these extra lives, you take 40% less damage and deal 20% more global damage. This is really strong. 40% less damage is about 67% more health. That's much less than 120% health, but Strength makes your healing more valuable, right? If each point of your health is about 67% more valuable, then healing is 67% more valuable. And so Strength is able to make up for the survivability difference off the back of its better healing. And 20% more global damage is nothing to scoff at, right? Global damage in particular is something that's really powerful. In a future video, I will discuss damage a little bit more, and one of the things that we will talk about is how powerful it is to take a bunch of different effects, right? A bunch of different damage sources, and buff all of them with a single global damage multiplier. And so Strength is incredibly strong, but you should only take one of these. And which one should you take? That largely comes down to preference, right? I personally prefer Debt for a couple reasons. The first is that you don't take overkill damage with that, right? Let's say you have 10 HP and you take a 30 damage hit. You only lose those 10 HP and then you revive with all 40% of the health that the Debt Defiance is supposed to give you. So that is a little bit better in that way. But also, more importantly, there are NPCs who you can interact with in the third biome of each route, which have the potential to give you back all of your Debt Defiances. And these can be absolute run savers, right? So, choosing Debt gives you the chance to have this get out of jail free card. Especially towards the end of the game, right? Having extra, there is a keepsake that you can get that increases your chance of getting all of your Debt Defiances back, and that is really, really powerful. The other thing is that as you play in higher and higher fear, one of the vows that you're going to take is probably going to be the vow of scars, which reduces your healing, and you can have it reduce your healing by 50% or by 100%. And in either case, Strength becomes weaker because your healing is less valuable, right? And that's one of the advantages of Strength is that it works with healing really, really well. That said, I think the choice between these two largely comes down to personal preference, especially at lower fear, where you're not likely to be playing with reduced healing on. Now, in my Arcana loadouts, I'm probably going to assume Debt first, just because that is what I traditionally play with, and so that is what I know a little bit more about. But I'll give some ideas for how to how to choose your Arcana if you instead decide to go with Strength. Alright, so now let's return to the top left. The Sorceress, your Omega moves are 30% faster. Okay, so the Sorceress is pretty easy to describe. If you're using your Omega moves, then it's very powerful, right? 1 Fear, you get 30% faster Omega moves, that's just very, very strong. If you're not using your Omega moves, then obviously you just don't take it, right? And there's plenty of one grasp Arcana cards, which are perhaps not as good, but are universally useful, and you simply take one of them instead. The Wayward Sun, after you exit a location, restore 5 health. This is incredible. It is a must take, right? As long as you have some amount of healing. So even if your healing is cut by 50%, you should take the Wayward Sun. And so especially if your healing is not cut at all, you absolutely should take the Wayward Sun. To give you an idea, you're probably going to go through about 30 to 40 locations by the end of the run. That could be more than 100 healing, right? It's not probably going to reach 150 to 200 because you're going to end some locations at full health and you can't overheal. But still, 100 to 150 extra healing by the end of the run is the equivalent of 4 to 6 Centaur Hearts, which is really, really strong. If you are running max scars, right, then obviously you simply don't take the Wayward Sun anymore. But up until that point, absolutely take it. It is cheap and it is extremely, extremely strong. Okay, the Huntress. For 2 grasp, while you have less than 100% of your magic, your attack and special do plus 50% damage. So first to explain this, right, when you have less than 100% of your magic, right, what this means is that you must have used magic during the room. This might seem obvious, but in particular, right, primed magic doesn't count for this, right? Let's say you have 100 magic and then you prime 20 of it. You're not using less than 100% of your magic. Your new max magic is 80%, is 80, right? And so the Huntress doesn't activate, and that is important to remember. The other thing is that when it says your attack and special deal plus 50% damage, what they mean is literally your basic attack strikes and your basic special strikes. This doesn't affect, for example, your Poseidon attack boon, right? Poseidon gives you a wave that does 20 damage. The Huntress doesn't affect it at all. It also doesn't affect your Omega attack or Omega special, so it is incredibly limited. And so what I find is that while at the beginning I ran the Huntress on nearly everything, and I think perhaps while you're still trying to get some of the better Arcana found towards the bottom of the screen, that you should run the Huntress. As you advance through the game, as you get more grasp and better cards, the Huntress starts to slowly get pushed out. It's never a bad Arcana card, it's just kind of a mediocre Arcana card. Some of the later damage increases are global, right? And that means that they apply to everything. They apply to your attacks, they apply to your Mega attacks, they apply to your cast, your extra waves from Poseidon, your extra lightning from Zeus, everything. And that is much, much stronger. And the difference, honestly, is kind of staggering. So the Huntress ends up being kind of a mediocre Arcana at the end of the day. Sometimes you take it, sometimes you don't, but more often than not, I find that I prefer something else over it. Eternity. While you channel your Mega moves, everything moves slower for 1.2 seconds. This one's a little weird. It sounds really good. It possibly is really good. In early access, there was a version of this that was slightly better, that was pretty good, or at least I thought was pretty good at the time. Perhaps that was my own inexperience. But whenever I run Eternity, I find that it just messes with me, right? Having people slow down and then speed back up, and then slow down and speed back up, it just messes with my muscle memory, and I end up feeling like I take more damage rather than less. All of which is to say, I wouldn't run it, but, maybe if you run it and you build up your muscle memory with it, it will turn out to be a lot better than it is in my less mechanically efficient hands. Okay, the Moon. Your Hex also charges up automatically as though you use 3 magic every 1 second. The Moon is interesting because it's the first of our Arcana cards that we're discussing that has this Awakening text. Right? To awaken it, you have to activate any surrounding card. And that means any of these 3. So it includes also the Unseen, despite that being diagonally adjacent. And the Moon is pretty good. Hexes are quite strong. They're in a good place. They have been buffed repeatedly throughout early access, and they're definitely really powerful. And the Moon does let you use hexes a lot more often. That said, when you think about the Moon's activation cost, you should think about in terms of, am I willing to activate Eternity, the Unseen, or Night for it? And I find that the Moon isn't good enough to convince me to activate one of these cards on its own. Right? I never feel like I'm going to activate the Moon, right, by, for example, taking Night, Not because I'm going to actually use Knight, but because the moon is just that good, right? So you could think of it more as a bonus for any of these three cards rather than a reason to take them. So let's continue kind of in a snake pattern. We'll go with the Knight. You have 15% chance to deal critical damage with each move in an Omega combo. So an Omega combo is essentially when you use one Omega move and then you use a different Omega move. And I'm going to show what that is just because it has a nice visual indicator and it may be easier to understand it if you see it. But this is potentially a pretty powerful Arcana. 15% crit is nothing to scoff at, right? Now you might be thinking, well, what about we just, scoffed at 50% more damage from the Huntress? What's the difference? Well, the first thing is that crit is actually twice as effective as you think it is, because crit is a chance to deal triple damage. But the other thing is that when you crit, this is a multiplier effect. It multiplies everything that happens. So, for example, when you take the Huntress, it's just 50% of your base damage. But when you crit, right, it's dealing triple of your base damage with the addition of any percentage boons that you have. So, for example, if you have Aphrodite's attack and you have like 100% extra attack, your crit multiplies that too. So it can be anywhere from like 80% effective to 100% effective to even more than that. Right, sorry, 80% to 100% to even more than that in terms of extra effectiveness compared to what you expect. Now, let's just see the Knight in action. So for example, let's say I use my Omega attack. Since I haven't used an Omega move, I don't get the Knight proc. But now that I use my Omega special, you can see, since it's a different Omega move, right, that I get the little skull, and that means I have a 15% crit on this. Now, we'll see if it actually procs. It did not, but it's still potentially quite powerful. This also works for your Omega cast, but notice that if I use my Omega special again, I don't get that 15% crit. And so the Knight is potentially really strong, but what I will say with the Knight is it's not a good enough reason to go for this Omega cycling playstyle by itself. Some of your aspects want you to go for that. That is naturally how they want to play. And so you should use it with those aspects, but this is not a reason to take a weapon that doesn't want to use its Omega moves or wants to use only one Omega move and then start cycling with it, right? That said, on weapons which do want to cycle, this is a must take. It is very, very good, and it is definitely a big perk to playing weapons like that. The Unseen is an interesting Arcana. So the first thing you'll notice is that it costs 5 grasp, which is way, way more than everything else we've discussed up to this point, except for debt and strength, right? And so you might imagine, okay, since it's 5 grasp, it must be really, really strong. And the reality is it's just not, right? And the way I'll explain this is it just doesn't really do anything, right? 10 mana per second sounds like a lot, but it isn't for a lot of reasons. One of the big ones being simply that 10 mana per second just isn't a lot for some of the mana hungrier aspects, which can just churn through 30, 40 mana every time they're attacking, and they're always trying to do that, right? Constantly. And so what ends up happening with the Unseen is that you take it, and then you find that it's not enough mana regen on its own, so then you have to go to a god to get their mana regen boon to supplement it. But most good mana regen boons from gods are so good that you don't need the Unseen, right? So the Unseen doesn't do enough on its own, and it doesn't really add something in combination with an actually good mana regen boon, and it's just not very good. Part of the reason for this is that it restores mana every second, and the way that this type of restoration works, right, mana per second, is that it doesn't work while you're charging your Omega attack. So let's just show as an example. As you can see, my mana is regenning, right? Let's just go through that again, right? So my mana starts to regen. But what if I attack and then start specialing? And as you can see, as long as I'm channeling my special, as long as I don't release it, the mana simply refuses to come back. So on a weapon which actually wants to churn through a lot of mana, right, a weapon that is mana dependent, a weapon who might actually consider using 5 grasp simply on getting more mana regen, it's just not very useful, right? Because that weapon is always going to be channeling, and it's just never going to get this bonus. And so, well, everything else I think is either situational or potentially only bad because I'm not really used to playing with them. I would say the Unseen is just flat out bad, right? It's just not good. Perhaps if it were lower grasp, you might consider taking it on a weapon that only wants to use its omegas occasionally, and some of the more complex weapons do want to do that, but on those weapons, using 5 grasp on such a marginal benefit for them is just not enough. Okay, the Messenger. Your casts momentarily make you impervious and move 70% faster. The Messenger is 1 grasp, and it's just kind of a nice to have type of thing, right? You take it when, in my experience, you take it when you have an extra grasp left over and you just want something to take, and I think it's pretty good in that role. Now, maybe it's just my own muscle memory was largely developed before the Messenger existed, so I'm not used to this kind of playstyle of seeing something about to attack me and using my cast to defend myself by giving myself invincibility frames. But in general, I just find that momentary imperviousness is just so small, it's hard to make use of. And the 70% faster movement is fine, but not crazy, right? I still like it quite a bit, and I still run it often, but it's more of a utility pick, and I can't honestly say I would miss it if I didn't have it. Persistence, you have 40 more health and 40 more max magic. So persistence is interesting. 40% more max health and 40% more max magic is definitely nice to have, but it's not that much by the end of the game, right? It's essentially the equivalent, especially for weapons that don't want to use their magic, right? It's just the equivalent of 1.5 centaur hearts, right? Which might be an incredibly marginal luck difference. But at the beginning of the game, persistence is really valuable, right? Because if you're at the beginning of the game, then you start with 30 max HP, and if you don't get lucky with centaur hearts, it's very easy to find yourself facing the final boss without having a max HP upgrade. And the final bosses are a lot harder at 30 max HP than they are at 70 max HP. So persistence, I think, almost pretty much automatically gets taken, not because it's that good in the late game in my experience, but because it's just necessary to be consistent in the early game. Okay, the Furies. You deal 30% more damage to foes in your cast. So I think a good way to think of the Furies is to contrast them with the Huntress, right? The Huntress gives you 50% more damage on your attack and special if you aren't at max magic. Now, the Furies have a lower percentage damage increase, and they have a harder condition to meet, right? Keeping foes in your cast can be difficult. It's a whole extra move that you have to use. Some enemies teleport, some enemies move fast enough that they get out of your cast. Especially bosses can do both of those things typically, so the Furies has a much harder condition to it. And yet, the Furies is much better, in my opinion. Why? Because the damage is global, right? This isn't just your attack and your special, right? It's your attack, it's your special, it's any extra effects you have from Poseidon or Zeus or Hestia or Hephaestus or so on. It's just a lot, right? And then obviously, if you have cast damage, for example, from Zeus cast, or even cast damage from something like Demeter's cast, it gets upgraded by this. And that can sometimes be kind of marginal and sometimes be a lot, but it is not meaningless. And so I find that while I don't really run the Huntress, I'm almost always running the Furies. Okay, the Swift Runner. Swift Runner says that your sprint is 10% faster and lets you pass through most foes in your way. The Swift Runner can be considered as a kind of a side grade to the Messenger, I find. They're both the type of thing where, you have one extra grasp left over and you decide to take them. I can't say it's incredibly noticeable, but I often just sort of take whichever one I'm feeling at the moment. Now, one thing to say about the Swift Runner is that it has a much better placement than the Messenger. We haven't really talked about placement because none of the Arcana cards that we have dealt with so far worry too much about placement beyond the moon. But sometimes you run the Swift Runner simply because it's better placed, and that's something that we'll talk about once we get towards the bottom of the Arcana page. Okay, that is something we've already talked about. The Centaur, you gain 5 more max HP and 5 more max magic whenever you pass through 5 locations. The Centaur is pretty close to Persistence, right? By the end of the run, at least, the Centaur will probably give you about 40 more max HP and 40 more max magic, give or take. But the thing with the Centaur is that it gives you that HP and max magic towards the end of the run when they are uh, at their least, let's say, where the difference is at its is mostly minimal, right? That said, the Centaur is not something that you choose. That's something you activate through this awakening condition that requires you to use cards that have 1 through 5 grasp. And honestly, you often just do this just naturally by filling out your Arcana page. And so, while the Centaur I wouldn't say is very very strong, it's so easy to activate that you really might as well. You honestly do it without even thinking about it most of the time. Okay, origination. Origination is really really powerful, right? I think up to this point I've only really described debt or strength and the wayward son as absolute must takes if you're in the right position for them. Origination is an absolute must take, regardless of the situation. 50% more damage to foes with at least 2 curses from Olympian gods is just very, very strong because, uh, well, first of all, curses from the Olympians are very powerful in general. This is something that you are going to want to do more or less naturally, right? But also, plus 50% more damage it's a global damage boost in the same way that the Furies is a global damage boost, but it's arguably easier to put on and it is quite a bit bigger. So this thing makes not just your attack 50% stronger or your special 50% stronger, it makes everything you do damage 50% stronger. Suddenly your Zeus boons are actually 1.5 times as strong as they were. Suddenly your Poseidon boons are 1.5 times as strong as they were. Getting origination, taking it, using it, making sure that you actually get the 2 curses and are able to apply them efficiently, that's a big part of any Hades run. And this is essentially something that I would argue that you should never leave off of your Arcana page. The lovers, you take 0 damage the first 3 times you're hit in Guardian encounters. So, the lovers is interesting. It's one of the stronger defensive. Is one of the stronger defensive Arcana cards, and it's something I really do like to take, right? Especially in High of Fear, where bosses deal potentially 100% more damage. It's just really, really good. That said, it's the type of thing that could very easily be kind of pushed out, where sometimes you just end up without the space for it, or you, for example, let's say you're playing a weapon that wants to have Night. I often find myself dropping the lovers to activate Night, right? But in general, if I can take it, I do want it. Now, one thing I'm going to say, just because I think it's interesting to note, is that the lovers work well with a particular keepsake, which is Artemis's keepsake. Artemis's keepsake gives you a large amount of crit. I believe it is 40%, if I remember correctly, which is akin to an 80% global damage boost. But they lock your max HP. I should correct that. An 80% multiplicative damage boost. An 80% damage boost that applies to not just that applies to all of your percentage effects as well, right? So it even makes origination stronger. And so that's a really big bonus, but the downside is also equally massive, perhaps even bigger. You are locked at 30 max health. And Artemis's Keepsake is something that's really hard to use. Obviously, it's used in speedruns, right? Just because you can't turn that down in a speedrun. But the Lovers offers an alternate way to use it, right, in non-speedrun environments. Because when you're at 30 max HP, every hit kills you, and so the Lovers essentially multiplies your safety by 4 in this case. And you can stack it with other things, right? So let's say, for example, that you have taken Artemis' Keepsake, but you have the Lovers, you have Armor from Hephaestus, right? You have Snow Queen from Demeter, and maybe you have Nitro Boost, right? So Nitro Boost gives you 1 free hit for an encounter as long as you're sprinting when you get hit. Snow Queen gives you 1 free hit per an encounter. Armor can essentially act as a free hit because when enemies do more damage than armor you have, you don't actually take that overflow. So you can think of that as being a free hit. And then with the Lovers, that's 3 more free hits, and at that point you're at 6 free hits, right? In addition to your 30 health. And maybe at that point you can actually start considering Artemis's Keepsake as a real weapon because it is a huge damage boost, and it doesn't cut your survivability by that much anymore. And so I think that's something to consider. Would I say it is good? Me personally, no, I wouldn't say that it's good, but I don't think it is that bad. And I know players who are better than me think it's good, so I feel the need to, or maybe okay is the right word. So I feel the need to mention it, and it is at the very least fun, right? It's something that maybe you should do at least once before you put down the game. Okay, the Queen. Any boons you find have a 10% chance to include duo blessings. Duo boons are quite strong, right? They're often the capstone for any build, so an extra chance to find them is pretty good. That said, I would say the Queen is a little bit more of a, if you happen to activate it, right? If you happen to achieve this awakening condition, then that's great, and if you don't, then you don't, right? That said, the loadouts that I tend to use do tend to activate the Queen, so it is kind of a happy accident. Excellence. Any boon you find has a 50% larger chance to include a legendary or at least rare blessings. Excellence is potentially quite strong. To be clear, the 50% chance to include a legendary is a, a relative increase to the chance that already exists. So it's not that if you take excellence and you meet the requirements for a legendary blessing, then you have you essentially have a coin flip every time you pick a boon to get the legendary. That's not what it does. But that said, having a higher chance to get rare blessings is pretty decent, especially for gods who have extra effects like Zeus, for whom having a rare blessing is an increase to their base damage, and increasing base damage is pretty powerful. Now, the problem with Excellence is that at 5 Grasp, it just is too much. It's so hard to fit. Already you're trying to fit Origination, already you're probably fitting a lot of the cards in the top left here. The Lovers, right? And then having to fit Excellence with some of the other cards that are also towards the bottom, it's just not feasible. So I often find that I don't use this, even though I think the effect itself is really not that bad. The Artificer. You have 3 chances this night to turn any minor find into a random major find. So minor finds are meta currency, and major finds are typically boons, right? Sometimes hammers, if I remember that correctly. And so the Artificer gives you potentially quite a bit of extra power towards the end of the run. That said, I don't use it very much, just because I don't think it's that necessary or that strong. Oftentimes, those last 3 boons are the boons that you need the least, right? And so the Artificer isn't that useful by the end of the run. Where the Artificer really shines at the beginning of the run, right? It can give you a lot of extra power at the beginning of the run. And where this especially matters is that if you start running the game with fear, right? One of the vows that you can take is you can put a timer on the regions. And the first region, Erebus, is quite long. And it can be quite difficult to get through Erebus when you are timed, right? Especially because one of the other vows that you can take turns your first boon into an onion, which of course, an onion is just a placeholder. It doesn't give you a benefit, and so losing out on your first boon really slows your roll, and it can make it very hard to get out of Erebus quickly. So you can take the Artificer in a situation like that where you're struggling to beat this timer, and it will help you get a boon much faster. And at that point, it's just so valuable to simply be able to get yourself out of the first biome that you just take the Artificer, even if it's not that good, towards the end of the run. Okay, so the Boatman, the Enchantress, the Fates, and the Champions have to be kind of talked together, and that's because the Fates activate when you activate all of the surrounding Arcana cards, right? And so it's important to sort of talk about them as a group. So I'm going to talk first about the Enchantress, right? The Enchantress gives you these nice dice, which are apparently called Change of Fate. You'll most likely hear people call them rolls or rerolls, right? So it gives you 3 rerolls, and these can be used to alter location rewards. So usually you use them to, let's say you're doing in a run and you see a god that you don't want that doesn't give you anything. You can use them to reroll off of that god and potentially find something much more useful. apologies, my controller decided to fritz. Okay, similarly, the champions give you 3 more rerolls, but these allow you to use your rerolls to alter boons and other choices. So what this means is that whenever you open a reward and you get a choice of 3, so this is boons, this is palms, this is not hammers. Hammers are exempt from this, right? So basically just boons and palms. Then, actually, I should correct myself. It is only boons and palms. It doesn't work for hammers. It doesn't work for NPC interactions. So it's only boons or palms, right? You can use a reroll if you don't like any of your choices to reroll the choices and potentially get new ones that you like more, right? And so these are both really quite strong because they allow you to manipulate the RNG, which means that once you know what you're looking for, once you know what boons are good on your weapons, what boons you want from specific gods, right? These allow you to both find those specific gods and find those specific boons with a lot more ease than before, right? Without these, you're really at the mercy of RNG, and if it turns out that, for example, let's say you want Poseidon or something, and you just never find him until the second biome, then like when you can force them, that's unfortunate, right? But with these, at least you give yourself a fighting chance. And the thing is, right, is that you usually want both of these together, right? Because together they give you 6 rolls that can be used to either alter location rewards or boon choices, and that is quite a lot of flexibility. And then at that point, you start thinking that, okay, maybe I want the fates, right? The fates give me 4 more of these, and so then I will have 10 of these rerolls to use. And at that point, you sort of convince yourself that in fact I should activate all of these, and so that's why I'm saying that they're kind of a group. And I do think you should activate all of these. Having 10 rolls is really strong. I think that having the ability to mold your build in that way is really strong, and so you should definitely have all 4 of these. And I have all 4 of these on in basically any Arcana any Arcana loadout that I create. One thing I'm going to say is that when you use these dice, when you use your rerolls to alter boons, the cost scales per each boon, right? So let's say you get a boon and you reroll it. The first one costs 1, the second one costs 2, and then this resets on the next boon, right? So like let's say you get a Poseidon boon and then you reroll it twice. That costs you 1 plus 2 is 3, and then your next boon, let's say you pick an Aphrodite boon, it costs you again 1 plus it costs you 1, and then if you reroll it again, it costs you 2, and if it rerolls again, it costs you 3, and so on, right? So you want to spread your rerolls out in terms of their uses, right? Specifically for when you're trying to alter boon choices. Okay, so now strength is something that we've already talked about. Divinity, any boons that you find have a 15% higher chance to include epic blessings. So this is also pretty powerful, and the condition to activate all 5 cards in any other row or column is relatively easy to activate most of the time. So it's something that I usually think you should go out and get. This, by the way, is why I was talking about the positioning of the Swift Runner over here. As it turns out, the Swift Runner is in a pretty prime position that you can often use to activate this more easily. And then Judgment is an interesting Arcana card. It requires you to activate no more than 3 Arcana cards. Now, specifically, what does this mean? This means only Arcana cards that you yourself actually activate. So, for example, let's say I activate the Lovers here. Okay, I have both of these activated by their Awakenings. I activate the Knight. Suddenly I have 5, 6 activated by their Awakenings. And I can even activate, for example, Death. And because I've only activated 3 cards myself and the rest were done automatically, Judgment doesn't actually deactivate, right? Now, is Judgment good? What I would say is that Judgment is usually kind of a challenge run, right? Or at least it's its own individual type of run that you do because you think it's fun, right? The only time I would say that you should use Judgment to try to complete the game is specifically when you're using what is probably the most difficult optional difficulty setting in the game, which is the Vow of Void. The Vow of Void reduces the amount of grasp that you can take on, right? And then if you have very low grasp, then you might as well activate Judgment, and then Judgment will activate your Arcana cards for you, and potentially by the end of the run, you can end up with a pretty decent full set. Okay, so that's all of the Arcana cards. How do I normally use them? So my first thing is that I have to pick between debt or strength. I'm gonna just pick debt first because that's my typical preference. Then origination to me is a must. If I'm running without the Vow of Scars at max level, then I take the Wayward Son. Right. Then I usually decide that I do in fact want the Boatman, the Champions, and the Enchantress to get these 10 rolls, which I think are quite powerful. Persistence is nice. It activates the Centaur for me, it activates the full column for me, so it's not just a very nice thing to have early, but it also gives me 2 Awakenings that are both pretty good. At this point, I usually decide I want the Furies, because the Furies, even if it's a little bit difficult to keep foes in your cast, it's not that hard, and 30% global damage is meaningful. And then here, I have some choices to make. Usually, if I have no special considerations, I take the Lovers. And then I think, well, okay, do I want the Messenger or the Sprinter? And that's why I say it's kind of personal preference to me, right? If I'm running an Omega attacking weapon, then you take the Sorceress for the 30% boost. If you are not doing that, let's say that you want to run Knight, right? Then instead of taking the Lovers, what I would say is that you take Knight, and then you can probably want to take the Sorceress, and then once you've taken the Sorceress, you might as well take either the Messenger or the Swift Runner. Okay, so what if you want to take Strength instead of Debt? So the only real thing that I would say changes here is that you no longer have this nice free column activation here. And so if you want to activate Divinity, then you need to put in a little bit of extra effort into it. So for example, one easy way to do it is to take the Sorceress and the Swift Runner. This does lock you out of the Queen though, right? You can also just say that, I don't really want or care about Divinity, and you can do things as normal. For example, this is a fairly a common thing I run. Or for example, if I'm running Knight, then this, and this, and this. The last thing I'm going to say is, specifically, if you are an aficionado of the Huntress, and I know some people are, then instead of running Knight, you can run the Huntress and then run both the movement options, and this is also fairly okay. Okay, so I think that about wraps things up. Thank you for watching the video. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you liked it. And hopefully next time I come back, actually the next time I come back, I'm going to probably release an addendum to this video, right, specifically about the rolls, because the rolls, while they are powerful on the Underworld route, they are particularly powerful on the second route. It's not something I want to talk about too much in this video, because, well, the second route takes a little bit while to unlock, and while I don't think its existence is a spoiler, seeing as Supergiant put it into the game, actually going into the first biome, I think would be a spoiler, and I don't want to have spoilers. I don't have in-depth discussion of spoilers in this video, so I'm going to probably relegate that to a second video. And then once I release that, hopefully I'm going to release a video on the damage system, around the math behind the damage system, so that you can truly understand why I've been harping so much about global damage as opposed to, individual damage. Why I think that the difference is so powerful. Okay, so yes, thank you, and goodbye.